All right, let's get into it. Sam Harris's Waking Up isn't just a book about meditation or atheism. No, it's much more. It's a deep philosophical dive into consciousness, a neuroscientific look at the idea of the self, and a total reimagining of spirituality for a secular world. What Harris is really trying to do is build a bridge between rational, scientific inquiry and that deep contemplative part of us, a bridge that for a long time religion has seemed to own, but really doesn't.
Harris kicks things off by tackling this big cultural tension we all feel. On one hand, spirituality often gets dismissed by skeptics because it's all wrapped up in religious jargon. But on the other hand, the actual experiences it points to, things like inner peace, a sense of transcendence, compassion, selflessness, those are undeniably real and can be totally transformative.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with what he calls the spirituality problem, then dive into the mystery of consciousness and the riddle of the self. After that, we'll get practical with meditation, explore some of the more controversial topics like gurus, drugs, and death, and wrap it all up with his big idea, a secular path to awakening.
All right, so let's jump right in with that first point, the spirituality problem. This is really all about facing that tug of war between our rational, scientific minds and our deep inner experiences.
So what's the problem exactly? Well, Harris argues that for centuries, religion has kind of claimed ownership over spiritual experience, like it has a monopoly. Because of that, a lot of atheists and skeptics just steer clear of the whole topic, afraid of being linked with any kind of mysticism. But the downside is we're leaving this huge, fascinating part of our inner world totally unexplored, these depths of the human mind that science hasn't really gotten a handle on yet.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Harris redefines spirituality. He says it's not about believing in supernatural stuff. Instead, it's fundamentally about the quality of our experience, right here, right now, from one moment to the next. It's about exploring our own consciousness directly.
And he's not just talking theory here. He shares his own stories, from meditation retreats, experiences with psychedelics, and encounters with different spiritual teachers. All of this convinced him that, yeah, this kind of profound psychological change is absolutely possible. And, this is the key, it doesn't require any faith, dogma, or complex metaphysics.
Then he ends the chapter with this really provocative claim. The self, that feeling of being a separate I inside your head, he says it's an illusion. And seeing through that illusion, well, that's the real start of waking up.
Okay, well, the self is an illusion? That's a massive claim. And to even begin to unpack that, we have to look at the very foundation of all our experiences. And that brings us perfectly to our next section, the mystery of consciousness. So here, Harris dives into the deep end, right? He looks at the huge questions that science is still scratching its head over, like the hard problem of consciousness. Just why do we have subjective experience in the first place? He talks about the limits of what neuroscience can tell us and how you can't just reduce our entire inner world to a bunch of firing neurons without losing everything that makes it feel meaningful.
He uses this great analogy. Consciousness is the canvas. Everything else, every thought, emotion, sensation, every memory you've ever had, it's all just paint on that canvas. It all appears within consciousness.
And this is where he challenges that idea of a stable self. He says, no, that's not how it works. Instead, think of it like this. Consciousness is a field. The self, that's just a story we tell ourselves. And experience is a constant flow, not something you own or hold on to. This chapter really lays the groundwork. If consciousness is the foundation of everything, then understanding it is what spirituality is all about.
Which leads us right into the real core of the book, both philosophically and experientially, the riddle of the self.
Okay, so let's get right to it. Harris argues point blank that the self, that feeling you have of being the thinker behind your thoughts, the little person in the driver's seat, is actually an illusion created by the mind.
So how do you see this? He says this is what meditation reveals. When you really pay attention, you notice that thoughts just pop up out of nowhere. Emotions appear without some controller pulling the strings. And that hard line you feel between yourself and the rest of the world, it starts to feel a lot more blurry, more porous.
He pulls a lot from Buddhist philosophy here, explaining that the self isn't a thing, it's a process. It's like a story that's constantly being rewritten. He talks about these amazing moments of insight where that feeling of being a separate me just dissolves. Awareness gets really wide, and experience just happens, without a central I at the helm. And he's clear, these aren't some kind of supernatural mystical states. They're real psychological possibilities available to anyone who's willing to look at their own mind closely enough.
So the big takeaway here is really powerful.
Real freedom, he says, begins the moment we stop automatically identifying with that constant voice in our head.
Okay, so that sounds great, but how do you actually do that? How do you stop identifying with your thoughts? Well, that question leads us directly to the practical side of things, meditation. He explains this isn't about trying to achieve some blissful state, but about learning to just observe your experience without judgment, to see thoughts for what they are, and to notice the awareness that's always there in the background.
And he breaks it down into two main types. You've got concentration meditation, which is all about training your attention on one single thing. And then there's insight meditation, or vipassana, which is more about observing the nature of your experience as it unfolds. What's really important to Harris is that we see meditation as a trainable skill, not some dusty old religious ritual. It's a tool, a method for looking at your own consciousness directly, kind of like how a scientist uses a microscope to look at the physical world. So it's not about escaping from reality. It's about seeing reality with way more clarity.
All right, so the next section gets into the broader landscape of spiritual seeking, and it doesn't shy away from some of the really complex and, frankly, controversial parts. We're talking gurus, drugs, and death.
Harris touches on a few key things here. First up, gurus. He says insight does not guarantee moral integrity. Then, psychedelics. He acknowledges they can open doors, but they can't keep them open. Next, death. He argues that confronting our own mortality is actually essential for awakening. And finally, ethics. He makes the case that any real spirituality has to be grounded in things like compassion and rationality, not blind faith.
And all of this, everything we've talked about, leads to his final big idea, which is basically a manifesto for a whole new way of thinking about this stuff, a secular path to awaken.
So when you boil it all down, waking up is really a manifesto for a spirituality that's totally secular. It's grounded in science, it's based on your own direct experience, it's a path you walk using tools like meditation, guided by psychological insight, and it's always about looking directly at your own consciousness. Harris is challenging all of us to look past rigid belief systems and just explore the nature of our own minds for ourselves.
The book's central message is incredibly powerful, and I think it's the perfect place to leave it. It's this: you can live a deeply spiritual life without believing anything on insufficient evidence.